Hello everyone, and in today's video we're going to be covering over a German tank destroyer that operated in World War II with the German army, in which it was known by its official name of 10 cm Panzerstabssalefette 4, although most people nowadays know the tank as the Dicker Max. This tank was an SBG that was initially designed as a bunker buster tank that was meant to engage enemy heavy fortifications that would prove too difficult for any horse-drawn or vehicle-drawn artillery pieces to advance and destroy without the crew being harmed. The design of this tank would be somewhat novel for Germany, as at the time during the 1920s and 30s, Germany was restricted by the Treaties of Versailles in their ability to develop modern military equipment, and this included extreme restrictions on the development of tanks. But as time passed by in the 1930s, with the Nazi Party taking control, and the new German leadership becoming more brazen in their disregard for the restrictions, by quickly expanding and upgrading its military strength. And much like the Stuart Mill tank destroyer that I covered in the past, Germany would then start accelerating the development of more modern tank designs that would address some of the situations that would be encountered. One of these areas would be the engagement of heavy armed fortifications using self-propelled vehicles that mounted large caliber weapons that could both be able to keep up with the German army's advance, as well as being able to damage these fortifications whilst being sufficiently protected from small arms fire. And considering Germany had planned to invade France, with the most likely area that most people thought Germany would strike first would be along the French-German border, of which the Germans would have to bust through the Maginot Line, which was a series of reinforced lines of armoured bunkers, trench lines, and fortifications that spread across the French and German border. The downside for the German military is that they lacked the said specialised vehicles that could deal with these fortifications. This would spur on further development on said specialised vehicles that could deal with the problem, and it would eventually lead to the designs of the Dicker Max and the Stuart Mill. The design of the Dicker Max would be started in 1939 between two different organisations, the German manufacturing giant Krupp and WWII, with the latter one being a tank design bureau. Together they would collaborate and generate different design proposals that would meet the requirements for a bunker buster tank. The design proposals would be centered around making an SBG that would mount the 10.5 cm Canon 18L52, which was a field gun designed in the late 1920s, but didn't enter serial production until in 1933, due in part to the Treaties of Versailles preventing Germany from building more advanced artillery guns. This new field gun would be replacing the aging 10.5 cm LFH-18 howitzer. The main improvement over the older field gun was the increase in firing range from 13 km to 19 km, as well as the increase in muzzle velocity. This was due to the longer barrel length of 52 calibers or 5.46 meters, compared to the older howitzer's barrel length of 28 calibers or 2.94 meters length. When the cannon was mounted on the Dicker Max, it was then given the designation of 10.5 cm K18 cannon. With the choice of gun now discussed and chosen, all that was needed was to design the tank that would mount the gun. To this end, the chassis of the Panzer IV would be chosen, as this was at the time Germany's most produced tank that could actually mount the 10.5 cm gun. The development timeline of the Dicker Max started either just before or in April of 1939 as conceptual drawings W1298 and W1299. And on the 25th of the same month, a meeting was then held between the designers and the engineers from both companies to discuss the flaws of the different conceptual drawings. One of the few things that came out of the meeting was that the main gun of the new tank would use a two-piece ammunition, as it would be possible for it to be loaded with 3 different amounts of ammunition charge, which could be used for different ammo types. With the second reason being that the gun could be reloaded at any gun elevation arc, due to the fact that the ammunition was separated into smaller pieces. The positioning of the engine was also discussed, and in the opinion of WWII 6, it was preferable if the engine could be mounted just below the gun, in order to reduce the overhang of the gun, as it would be able to be mounted further back into the design. However, this would make the design of the engine cooling and the access to the engine more difficult. After the meeting was concluded, design drawing W1300 would then be drawn up, implementing some of the changes that were discussed. And in the very next meeting on the 2nd of May 1939, which would be going over the various different engine choices that could be used for the design. The first choice of engine would be a 300 horsepower 6-cylinder Maybach HL116 engine, which would ultimately later be used for the Stuart Emile. The second engine would be a 300 horsepower V12 Maybach HL120, and the final engine choice would be a 200 horsepower 6-cylinder Maybach HL66 engine. The problems with the different engines was also discussed. The main problems with mounting the HL116 in the rear would mean that the main gun of SPG would have to be mounted higher, as the engine was slightly taller, whilst the V12 HL120 would bring the gun height down by 100mm, which would improve the stability of the tank after firing the gun. But this engine weighed 200 kilograms heavier than the HL116. But in the opinion of WWII 6, they thought that the HL66 engine, with only 200 horsepower, would be enough for the tank, as it was both smaller and lighter. But the engineers from Krupp thought that the engine power of the HL66 engine was far too low for decent acceleration, as the tank had an estimated weight of around 20 tons at the time. The gun was also discussed in this meeting, and it was decided that it would have a muzzle brake mounted to reduce the recoil stroke of the gun when firing from 1 meters to 80 centimeters, which would allow the gun to be moved further back into the rear of the design. In another meeting on the 15th of May 1939, Krupp would present design drawing W1301 and W1303. The main difference between the two different design drawings was that the design drawing W1301 managed to provide good access to the HL116 engine for maintenance by transversely mounting it whilst also shifting the transmission unit to the side of the tank. The estimated weight of this design being around 24 tons. W1303, on the other hand, would mount the Maybach HL66 engine, along with a few other changes that would bring the weight down to 22 tons. And between the two different design drawings, WWII 6 decided in favour of design drawing W1303, and then they would give approval for a 1:1 scale wooden mock-up of the design. And by August the 10th, the wooden mock-up was then completed and examined in depth by WWII 6, in which they rated it quite favourably. Discussions then shortly followed after on ways on how to reduce the estimated weight of the design, which consisted of reducing the internal hole size from 1.95 meters to 1.85 meters. Other changes included the lowering of the deck in the crew compartment by 100mm, moving the engine cooling and ducts to behind the rear wall of the tank, which would allow the gun to be moved further back into the design, and the roof would also be lowered by 80mm. On the 21st of August, the final decision on the power plant was then made. The design would be powered by a modified version of the HL66 engine, called the Maybach HL66P, which outputted 188 horsepower at 3,200 RPM. This choice of suspension would also be decided on, as the final design would be using a leaf spring type suspension, with 8 road wheels that was used on the Panzer IV, as it was already a proven suspension unit, whilst also allowing the gun height of the tank to be reduced even further. During the same meeting, WWII 6 then gave advance approval for the manufacture of 3 Dicamaxes. 2 of them would be made with an 8 road wheel suspension unit used by the Panzer IVs, with the third one being made with a unique 6 road wheel suspension unit, and the test weight being installed in place of the gun. The third tank was more of a test on improving the turning and handling characteristics of the design. On the 1st of September, after approval was given, the foundries at Krupp's Work would be assigned to produce some of the parts for the final design, and on the 4th of September, another meeting was held with the design construction papers then being discussed. The armor thickness of the tank would be around 50mm thick at the front of the hull, and 30mm thick at the front of the superstructure, with the sides being around 20mm thick. These plates were to be made out of face-hardened steel as much as possible to improve the armor protection that it offered. Also in this meeting, the third Dicamax that would use the 6 road wheel suspension unit would be cancelled. On the 19th of September 1939, the official design guidelines would then be given to Krupp by WWII for the design of the Dicamax, and on the 10th and 11th of October of 1939, Krupp would then be in the meeting with WWII to discuss the final changes before producing the 2 prototypes. The subject of that meeting was that the specifically made custom transmission and steering unit that was going to be used for the Dicamax would not be installed. It was then suggested by WWII that the steering and transmission unit from the Panzer IVs could be used instead. But the problem with the transmission on the Panzer IV was that the engine of the Dicamax was only rated for 188 horsepower, and so it would only be powerful enough to reach a top speed of 27 km per hour. Krupp did propose using a different transmission designed from Samrad fabric that was designated AKA-6S55, and a much beefier 200 horsepower engine that would most likely give the tank a much higher top speed. But this change wasn't implemented, and on the 4th of November 1939, the final decision was made to use the transmission and steering unit from the Panzer IVs, in order to avoid delays of the manufacture of the 2 prototypes. The production of the 2 Dicamax tanks was started in April of 1944, but the tanks wasn't completed until the very next year in January of 1941. The design of a Dicamax would consist of the hull for Panzer IV that had been extensively modified, with the turret and frontal hull sections being either removed or expanded, and at the rear and mid-section of the tank, a superstructure would be constructed that would house the main gun and the fighting compartment of the tank. The engine space would be also modified to make use of the reduced size of the Maybach HL66P engine, and right in front of the superstructure, there would be 2 compartments. One of them on the left side of the tank would house the driver and the main tank's drive controls, whilst the second compartment being a false compartment. I have no idea if it was just an empty space or metal box put on top of the tank, as the various sources didn't really mention anything else about the false compartment. In regards to the specifications of the Dicamax, the tank was around 7.47 meters in length, which included the gun overhanging, the width being around 2.86 meters, and the height being around 2.53 meters. The armor thickness of the tank was around 50mm at the front of the hull, with the sides and rear being around 20mm thick and 10mm thick. The front of the superstructure was also 30mm thick. The weight of the tank was around 22 tons, with the engine being the previously mentioned 188 horsepower Maybach HL66P engine that gave the Dicamax a top speed of 27 km per hour, with a road range of 170 km. The gun that was equipped was the 10.5cm K18 cannon, that had a gun traverse of 8 degrees to each side, with its elevation arc being -15 to +10 degrees. The Dicamax featured no hull-mounted machine guns, as it was envisioned to operate as a second-line support, with infantry being used to support the tank, although the crew would have access to MP40 submachine guns stored within the tank. On the 21st of March 1941, the 2 Dicamaxes were then demonstrated in front of Hitler. and they would then be sent to the 521st Panzerjägerabteilung on the Eastern Front for field trials. And if these trials came back with success, then serial production of the Dicamax would be granted. The two tanks would arrive with the unit just before Operation Barbarossa, and in a report dated the 26th of June 1941, the 521st Panzerjäger Group took part in Operation Barbarossa, engaging the Soviet infantry on the 23rd of June east of Korbin, in what is today modern Belarus. And on the 24th of the same month, the unit then engaged artillery positions near the river crossings of Shisawa, whilst assisting the attack of two German motorcycle companies. On the 30th of June, the unit would engage a Soviet armored train in Belarusnia, east of Bobruisk, near the Dnieper River. But due to a broken bolt in one of the steering brakes of the tanks, they couldn't engage the Soviet train before it fled. During the advance to Shlok, north of Minsk, one of the Dicamaxes caught fire and the crew luckily bailed out without any loss of life. The cause for the fire and the explosion was not exactly known, but it's been speculated that one of the propellant cartridges was set off from the heat of the engine heating compartment, where the cartridges were stored. The destroyed tank would then be salvaged for spare parts, as the damage to the hull was too extensive to warrant repairing it. The last remaining Dicamax would still be active with the unit towards the end of 1941. The sole surviving Dicamax would then be sent back to the Krupp factory for repairs, and after it was repaired, it was then sent back to the 521st Panzerjäger Group, where it was also joined in by two new Stuart Mill tanks. The Dicamax would then continue to fight with the unit until in November to December of 1942, where it was reported as not operational by the unit in their report, most likely suffering the same fate as the Stuart Mill that was named Max, being destroyed by the Soviets and then potentially dragged off back for investigations, before shortly being scrapped thereafter. And that was the history of the Dicamax. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this content, please put a like and subscribe to get more videos like this. If you have a vehicle that you want to know about, let us know in the pinned comment section down below.